Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Burton Suite October charity catch-up. My goodness me, where is the year going? But we're delighted that you've joined us this morning, whether you're here, this afternoon, in fact, whether you're here for the first time or whether you're here with us every time. We're really delighted to see you. My name is Ed Marsh. I'm Head of Charity Development at Burton Suite, and I'm here with my colleague Cecile Gillard, who's Charity's Legal Manager. And we're really looking forward to spending this hour together to have a chance to share with you some latest news and updates, to reflect on some key topics, but also to give a chance to share together any questions or reflections or comments we've got. We're going to be sharing some slides and some content for the first 45 minutes or so, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask some questions or make any comments or have any reflections you have on what we've shared. You can do that in a couple of different ways. One is that you can at any point during the event put a comment or a question in the chat function, and we'll pick things up at the end, but obviously everyone will have a chance to share in those and to reflect back their own thoughts if that's helpful. Also, just at the very end, we'll have an opportunity for people to come on screen and ask a question in person if you'd like to do that out loud. So we'll let you know when that point comes. As usual, we're recording this event, particularly for the benefit of those that signed up but weren't able to make it, or indeed for you, if you would like to revisit the content that we've covered today. There'll be no names or faces on that recording other than Cecile and mine, but hopefully that will be helpful to you. As well, we'll be sending you this afternoon a copy of the slides as well, so that whatever appears on screen, you'll get a copy of that, just so that you'll be able to reflect further on the content. We'd also love you, when we email that later on today, we'd love to hear back from you with how you found it today, and particularly any suggestions for future topics that we could cover. But this afternoon, we are covering a range of topics, and I'd just like to say a little promise. I don't think we're going to mention U-turns at any point during our event, and indeed we're going to not speculate at all on who will be Prime Minister by the end of Q&A. So hopefully it's a relatively politics-free zone this afternoon. But what we are going to cover is particularly, we're going to be thinking about charity fraud awareness. It is this week Charity Fraud Awareness Week, and this is such an important topic for charities and charity trustees to pay attention to. Research that was released by the Charity Commission this week has said that 1 in 8 charities have experienced cybercrime in the last 12 months. But that research also found that around half of charities were not really aware of the risks around cybercrime, and they weren't really taking steps to protect themselves. So we're going to ask today why charity fraud awareness matters, why we should care about it, and also what we can do about it. And we're going to be covering a couple of other topics, particularly around public trust and confidence in charities, but also thinking a bit about these uncertain economic times and what we as trustees and charity people can be doing as we operate in that environment. So hang on to your seats. We're going to have a chance to have a think about these topics together. And first of all, I'm going to hand over to Cecile.
Thank you, Ed. If you could move the slides on, that would be lovely. Thank you very much. So we're going to start by thinking about charity fraud awareness and putting that into the context of the role of charity trustees. This is an important subject for all charities and for all trustees. It sadly can, and it sadly does happen anywhere, at any time, and in any charity. It's an all year round issue, and one that we do have to be alive to. And when I say it's an all year round issue, one of the reasons I say that is because it is therefore a topic that should be on trustees' agenda all the time. There is a long agenda. It's certainly true for trustees to be dealing with all the time, but the protection of the charity against forms of abuse is undoubtedly something that should be there and part of the trustees' normal course of activity and thinking and behaviours. Ed's just given a shocking statistic for many people. I suspect 1 in 8 charities affected by cybercrime. If you looked at statistics for other types of crime, you'd get equally bad figures. Whilst various forms of fraud are more prevalent in other sectors than the charity sector, there's no doubt about it. It is sadly all too prevalent in the charity sector. So if numbers matter to you and numbers are what persuade you, believe us that the numbers are persuasive. But it shouldn't be just numbers and probabilities that are persuading you. We need to come back, I think, to the principles of what being a trustee is all about. Trustees are stewards for society and custodians for the general public. When fraud occurs, the trust of those who fund and support charities is betrayed. The trust and confidence of the public in the charity sector as a whole is undoubtedly damaged, and there's a negative impact on the whole charity sector. So we need to think about our fellow charities and the impact of us failing would have on them. And of course, absolutely critically, when a fraud incident occurs, it will damage our charity's capacity to help the people it's there to help. And we should be doing our utmost to prevent that damage happening for that reason too. We touched a little on that one statistic, but I want to try and make us think more broadly about the fact that both internal and external fraud continue to grow within charities. I want to encourage you to see how wide the risks are potentially. Internal fraud happens, and that's truly shocking in charities because we tend to regard them as nice places where people behave well because they care about the cause. But so does external fraud, because people will target our organisations and not respect the reasons for which they exist. And areas of risk, well, multiple. Donations, grants, fundraising, other income all get abused. Harm is done by abusing assets and expenditure of charities. There's fraudulent activities, certainly in cybercrime and electronic crime, but whilst those are important areas of activity where fraud takes place, we mustn't be naive and imagine that other forms of fraud are less important, less likely, and less to worry about. So we need to think about identity impersonation. That's often tied up with some form of electronic communication, but we need to think about direct theft of items and funds. We need to think about falsifying and fictionalizing activities, which is often a method of fraud. We need to think about banking transactions, from cash to payment to electronics to anything else. Card fraud, it remains a major problem, for example. We need to think about our physical assets, and where we use cash in a charity, we need to think about cash. We need to understand that there's all kinds of ways of doing fraud, direct theft, and all kinds of other misappropriation of funds for improper purposes. All of which means that as trustees, we've got to be wise and we've got to be aware of the risks and how to reduce them. Thank you, Ed, if you could move us along. Now, charity law is quite clear that ultimate responsibility for all of this sits with the trustees, because legally they have ultimate responsibility for and control over the charity, and they must use that control effectively. The ultimate responsibility is underpinned by trustees' core general duties. It's well worth coming back to revisit these, and in the context of fraud, the items numbered 4 and 5 here in front of you are the perhaps most critical: the duty to manage the charity's resources responsibly, and the duty to act with reasonable care and skill. Now, where charities allow funds and other resources to be misappropriated and misused, the chances are trustees have not acted well enough to meet the standard required by those two duties. There hasn't been responsible resource management, and there hasn't been reasonable care and skill taken within the running of the charity. That may have happened at various levels, but in the end, it will have, to a certain extent, happened at trustee level, Otherwise, the incidents would not have occurred. Thank you, Ed, if you could move us on. The charities are founded on trust, and they are generally pretty nice places to be around. But within the trust, we've got to get a sense, I think, of realism. There have to be controls and checks. You have to keep the charity's resources safe, and you have to ensure they're properly used. Awareness of fraud and taking action on fraud prevention are critical to all of that. And to seek to prevent fraud, accepting that we can't actually prevent absolutely every incident necessarily, but we must always be mindful of reducing the risk and reducing the incidents. To seek to prevent it, we've got to get the tone from the top right. That means a clear anti-fraud culture is a key part of defence. So the board should be clear to everybody involved with the charity that fraud is simply never acceptable at any level, no matter what the circumstances, and clear that it will not be tolerated. This is not what we do. People should be encouraged to be vigilant. They should be encouraged to speak out about concerns in a supportive atmosphere where they know they will be taken seriously and their concerns will be looked into. Having strong governance is a vital anti-fraud tool. So building governance strength is a key action for trustees to take. How you do that begins, I think, with that commitment to the culture I described, which accepts and values rigorous governance by the board as part of the zero tolerance culture to charity fraud. People need to respect the role of the board as the ultimate governing body and the fact that they have ultimate responsibility and need to be allowed to use it. Also, how do we strengthen the governance in other ways? Well, certainly ensuring there's adequate monitoring within the charity. What is actually being done with the funds and assets? The board has to have proper oversight of that monitoring, making sure it actively considers the monitoring processes and what they are indicating to the board. In addition, of course, this means that the board needs appropriate and timely information that it can understand and actively use. Financial information, certainly, like management accounts, are part of that, but it has to go well beyond the numbers. What information will enable the trustees to have active oversight of areas like staff and volunteer accountability, reliability of external relationships that the charity has, suppliers, service providers, partner organisations, external fundraisers, and more. And internal awareness of the overall issue of charity fraud is another key defence. People need to know there is something to be alert about here and understand how to report concerns about both risks and suspected incidents. And there should also be clarity within the charity about the fact that when an incident occurs or is suspected, relevant external reports will be made, and clarity about who has responsibility to alert the board and then who is taking necessary actions under the board's direction. Ed, if you could move us on. Thank you. Now, in relation to fraud awareness and fraud prevention, the Charity Commission suggests 10 areas of questioning that should be going on at trustee level about anti-fraud activities. Now, to be honest, some of them seem perhaps a bit obvious or a bit simplistic, and some, undoubtedly, most charities would already be doing. They're not a definitive list, but they are perhaps a start point to take a fresh look at fraud risks, fraud awareness, and how your charity is acting to combat those risks. There will be other areas where what you do may need to be freshened up or new actions implemented. These may be some of those areas. There may well be other areas. But I think thinking about, are you doing anything? What are you doing? Do you need to freshen it up? Do you need to do something new? Is all important. And one of the prompt questions to the far right on the blue speech bubble is a prompter on whether you have a response plan. So Ed, if you could move us on. which comes on to the matter of what to do if and when something does happen. Maybe you'll spend your whole time in relation to a particular charity and nothing will ever happen, but I'm afraid it could be when. So if an incident does occur or a suspicion arises, doing nothing is never the right response. Also, delaying taking action, for example, while you carry out the internal investigation, delaying taking any other action is not of itself appropriate. Think about the external reporting obligation. That should always be dealt with promptly. You will be carrying out other actions alongside it, and you should, like continuing investigations, like taking steps to stop a repeat of that incident, and like looking at how can we strengthen future defences, because this might be indicative of not only this type of incident, but the fact that perhaps we have weaknesses elsewhere where other issues could occur. On reporting serious incidents to the Charity Commission, of course, it is the responsibility of the trustees to do that, and the Commission expects them to make such reports promptly and to be as full and frank as possible in their reports. You should, of course, also certainly report incidents to Action Fraud, which is operated by the National Fraud and Cybercrime Centre. Website or phone number are the mechanisms for doing that. And although, of course, to a certain extent, data from that will end up shared with the police, think about, should you actually report to your local police force as well? There may be good reasons for doing that. They might include, amongst other things, the fact that then you've got two different channels where you're prompting the authorities to take action against the fraudsters. Of course, another key point, very practical point, is you will be given a crime incident number from your local police force, though you may have to keep at them to get that because of their resource issues. And of course, without a crime incident, you will be in an almost impossible position to pursue, for example, any insurance claim with your insurers. Keep really careful records of the reports you've made, monitor any responses, and of course, action any responses that come back from the authorities in relation to those reports. You might have a responsibility to report to other regulators that you are responsible to. Could be the Care Quality Commission, could be the regulator of social housing, could be a range of other regulators because of the nature of what your charity does. And think also, are there any obligations to report to other parties? That could, for example, be funders. Some funders will impose a requirement in funding agreements to disclose fraud incidents to the funder. So think about whether there are other reporting that has to be done. And I think the overall guidance really for charities is act promptly, investigate, record, do take professional advice. We're always here to help clients in tricky situations, as well as the more positive situations of running their charities. And do learn and do stay alert. It can happen again, not only because there is clear evidence that fraudsters often attack again, they will attack a target more than once, but also that repeat fraud incidents can come from a variety of other sources, as well as a variety of methods. If you've had a weakness somewhere that has allowed an incident to happen, that or a similar weakness or another inherent weakness in the relevant area in your charity could open the door to some other abuse. Again, remember, internal or external abuse. So those are some of the thinking for trustees, not very positive subject matter, but perhaps some ideas on positive ways to address the dangers and the risks. Ed, to you, please.
Thank you, Cecile. Just going to make some further comments on some considerations as we seek to build resilient systems and processes in our charities. What are some of the things we need to think about? We hope that in all of these events, you end up with a succession of actions that you can kind of have a little think about, and actually resources that you can use to be able to address what's been raised. And so here's just a key one for you today. CC8, which we mention very regularly, is an internal financial controls guidance, and also has a very, very handy checklist. And within that, there's a key kind of section on making sure that you particularly address some of the risks of fraud. And so we encourage you to use that checklist. We encourage all charities to review this checklist and to update it for their charities at least once a year. We'll link that in our post-event mailing today. But what are some of the key financial controls that we really should be having in place in our charities? And some of these will be obvious, but some of them perhaps ones that you've not really thought about too much before. So perhaps just take a note of any that are particularly relevant to you. I think that at the heart of financial control is having regularly produced, understandable management accounts. They're understandable updates for the charity trustees on the financial performance and position of the charity. Now, there's all kinds of reasons to have that information. That's the way to run a charity really well. But actually, it really helps us as trustees to understand what is normal for this charity. What do we expect this to look like? And actually, the more regularly we are and the more we understand our charity's accounts, the more we realise actually when something happens, when something looks a bit strange, unusual transactions happen, that actually they're easily spotted because we know what normal is, we know what unusual is. And also to encourage you, particularly if you're here on the call as someone who would consider yourself kind of less financially literate than some of your other trustee colleagues, is to always be willing to ask the obvious questions about those financial accounts, to raise the things that don't look right. Don't just assume that because you don't understand why it would show it like that, that actually that means it's right and it's just your understanding. Do take an opportunity to ask those questions. Having segregation of duties within charities is really vital where that's possible. We fully appreciate that many charities are very small, that actually many charities don't have paid staff at all. And actually there's a limited number of people involved in the charity's finances. So get creative. How can we make sure that there's more than one person involved in holding all of the finances together? More than one person who is looking and is approving and is involved in transactions. That's really vital. To make sure that you regularly reconcile key bank accounts and have regular reviews. The charity that I'm a trustee of, one of the trustees who's not particularly involved in the finance side of things, actually one of his jobs is just every month he just scans through the bank statements and he sort of asks challenging questions about what's this, what's that. Actually that might feel a bit over the top to you, but for us that's actually a really helpful kind of added kind of check that there's a kind of review of overall what are these transactions. It's not because of a culture of suspicion, it's a culture of control. It's a culture of deciding that actually we think that that fraud is so important that we need to go a bit above and beyond. To make a priority of having multiple or dual signatories on bank accounts is really vital. In fact, it will be required by a lot of grant funders in many cases. But think about online banking access too. Banks are gradually catching up with the need to have proper authorization processes, but that's not. They can be a bit inconvenient. They're not always the easiest systems to use. But I think that they should be a matter of priority for all charities. Perhaps trustees should consider just doing the odd spot check of payroll records every now and then. Do you recognise all the names on the payroll records? Are there any kind of unusual amounts that might have gone through? Looking for what's normal is always the thing. The change of bank details is a really kind of key area. Someone purporting to be a supplier or someone purporting to be one of your employees saying my bank details have changed, and they drop you an email, and it turns out that that's a fabricated email, and there's a whole long kind of chain of sophisticated sort of targeted phishing going on there. Now, actually, have a little think about how you would spot whether that was the case. Make sure you don't rely 100% on email for people to let you know change the bank details. Always double check that through a phone call, not using the phone number on the bottom of the email, but the phone number that you know is the right number. Actually consider other methods of secure communication, because email is not inherently secure. Many banks now have a confirmation of payee facility whereby it will warn you if there is an inconsistency between the sort code and account number and the account name. And do make sure you don't ignore those warnings, because that would be kind of very much at your peril. Knowing our beneficiaries, knowing our staff, knowing our volunteers and donors. Again, it's all about saying what do we understand to be the kind of normal behaviour and normal kind of processes that are in place, and actually it really helps us to spot when things happen that are outside of our expectations. So do some work on knowing who they are and making sure you have a clear understanding. Right, to make sure you have a list of your assets that you hold and regularly inspect that they are still there and they are still being used by the charity, that nothing's been misappropriated. Those are just some basic financial controls there. There's many more, and there are lots of things that you might even want to share of your own experience. Just very particularly thinking about cybercrime. I'm not an IT expert. I really don't want to be an IT expert. Doesn't sound like fun to me. But actually just thinking about some key aspects of cybercrime resilience. Again, awareness and training of staff, volunteers and trustees is absolutely critical to this. You don't need to be a computer scientist geek to understand the basics of how cybercrime can take place. And so make sure that there is that training and awareness, particularly of phishing risk, particularly of good use of passwords and how to handle data well. There's all kinds of benefits of that, but that's really, really important. Make sure you understand your systems and the vulnerabilities. What main applications are you using? And is everybody using those? Are people using those properly? Are we, sort of keeping things fairly simple around our use of technology? And sometimes when there's complexity, it kind of brings in real vulnerabilities. How do you make sure in this world of mobile devices and various different ways of communicating that actually when people are using devices for work, maybe they're personal devices for work, sometimes maybe your policy does allow that, but how do you make sure that those devices are secure? How do you make sure that there's access controls that mean that suddenly your entire ecosystem is not available through just a poor security? Make sure that there's regular data backups, should be fairly obvious. Then passwords are absolutely critical. Make sure that there's some good thinking about how you deploy passwords. Well, one, use them. That's absolutely vital. Email passwords are particularly critical because, as you know, if ever you need to reset a password, normally there'll be a link sent to your email. And if your email password's no good, then that's no good. So make sure you encourage and enforce good email passwords. Consider multi-factor authentication. It's a bit inconvenient getting a little code on your phone or via an app to be able to log in, but actually it's much more secure. So consider that. Help staff with password overload. Requiring your staff to change their passwords every 2 weeks will mean that they will have very, very simple, easy to remember passwords that are not very secure. Not best practice. I encourage instead to have, instead of changing passwords frequently, have long, unpredictable passwords, 3 unrelated words. We can think that a password is really secure if it's kind of one word and we change the O's for zeros. That's not the case at all. Think about having very long, unpredictable passwords. Make sure that security updates are deployed promptly. And then, of course, as Cecile's already said, make sure you report incidents. Not only is that important for, well, it's important for all kinds of reasons, but actually it really helps the learning process. It really helps us understand. It helps your organization. It helps the authorities to understand the ways in which organizations are being targeted. Let's all be part of that. There are plenty of resources, particularly here sitting in Charity Fraud Awareness Week, loads of resources. We'll put these out in an email afterwards. A lot of these are free resources that help to raise training and awareness of our charity people. So do that. And as Cecile mentioned, we're delighted to help out around charity fraud awareness, whether that's giving some training for boards, whether that's giving a little review of your fraud policies and documentation, whether that's around your risk management process and helping you with that, or particularly looking over your financial controls and helping enhance the quality of your management accounts. We would love to help with that, and do get in touch. But we're going to switch gears now and talk a little bit about public trust and confidence in charities. And this particularly arises from regular research that the Charity Commission commission each year. And most recently in April 2022, they didn't publish it till July, but really every year they're coming up with this research and talking about trends in to what extent is there public trust and confidence in charities in the sector as opposed to other sectors? And I guess the key question for us is, why bother thinking about this? Why does it really matter, public trust and confidence in charities? And of course, I think probably what we'll all appreciate as we think about our own charities is that the public being on board with what we do, having public support, having public involvement is absolutely vital for many of our charities. And our reputations are important to being able to do what we do. Our reputation of our charities in terms of the impact that we have is really vital. And so actually public trust and confidence is so important. And these are extracts from this public reporting, which may be of interest. This talks about the mean, the average trust and confidence by sector and group. And you can see here, charities are fairly near the top, which is wonderful. Actually, as the charity sector, we are on the whole trustworthy or trusted compared to other sectors of society. It won't be a surprise to you to see that again, this is not based on the last week or so, but MPs and government ministers, and I promise not to mention politics, the public trust and confidence in MPs and government ministers has gone down. Actually, over the last year, confidence in the police has gone down as well. But actually, you'll see that trust and confidence has gone down across all of these sectors across the board. But charities less than most. So I don't know, is that good news? Is that bad news? I'm not really sure, but that's the way it is. I mean, if we look at that over time, you can see that actually, compared to other sectors, charities have really kind of suffered a tumultuous last decade or so. And particularly, as we've been in a situation where there's been fundraising scandals, there's been safeguarding crises perhaps around Oxfam and overseas safeguarding incidents. There's been, perhaps negative headlines around senior charity pay. Actually, that charities have taken a bit of a hit. And what we saw was that actually in the last couple of years, that actually it had been really bouncing back, that it had been really recovering, and it looks like it's plateaued a little bit. So, that's the pattern and the trend that we're seeing as we think about trust and confidence in charities. But I think just a couple of observations and comments on this. I mean, I think one of the questions, of course, is who are the general public? We can think about the general public as if they're one homogenous body of people who all think and feel the same way about charities. And of course, that is not true at all. The reality is that across the country, across different demographics, there is actually quite a polarization of view of charities, that actually in different parts of the country, people had opposite views of charities and different sort of favorability and attitudes about what really counts. But what this research does say is that despite those differing opinions, there are some common themes. There's some common expectations of charities. And I think these are ones that we really need to be paying attention to. That actually, rightly or wrongly, the very highest priority, the highest expectation of the public is that a high proportion of charities' money goes on charitable activity. That actually there is a need to demonstrate that actually when people give to charity, that actually the highest proportion of that money meets the need for which it's given. That's very understandable. But actually a bit of a challenge sometimes to, there can be all kinds of differing expectations of charities that actually, they shouldn't spend anything on admin costs. They shouldn't employ staff. They shouldn't spend money on fundraising. And actually we have a message that we need to get out there that kind of says, this is how the money we spend makes a difference on the end cause. That actually another common theme is that actually the public expect charities to demonstrate that they are having the impact that they promise on society. And so actually it's inherent on us to be thinking, actually, how do we make our charities as effective as possible in making an impact? But of course, how do we tell that story really well? How do we make sure that the public know that they see the good that we do? And of course, that comes through our public reporting. It comes through the information we include on our websites. It comes through the information that we talk about ourselves in all kinds of different ways. How are we demonstrating that? Also, that the public care about how charities carry out their work. That actually, that charities should be doing things in the spirit of charity. They should be doing things with the highest possible ethical standards. They should be treating their staff well. They should be behaving well as charities. But also they should recognise that they have a collective responsibility, that they should be recognising that their behaviour impacts on the whole of the rest of the charity sector. And they expect charities to uphold that behaviour for the benefit of all charities, because all charities are in many ways painted with the same brush when it comes to charity, to public expectations. And so we need to be learning from this research, I think. We need to be recognising that what we say about ourselves, how we behave, how we, with clarity, account for the money and talk about where it goes is vitally important to upholding public trust and confidence. And Cecile, over to you for our last topic today.
Thank you, Ed, all very helpful. So navigating uncertain economic times, goodness me, that's an understatement, isn't it? Uncertain. Ed, could you move us on, please? Thank you. There's no doubt about it. We are in a situation which most of us have never lived through before, or which is greater, more significant, more dreadful than anybody could have imagined even just a couple of years ago, in terms of the challenges of the current economic situation in Britain, certainly, but also across the world. The interconnectedness of where the issues lie that are driving that, of course, is much talked about, very complex, but there's no doubt about it. We are in a really challenging time for trustees to navigate, an extraordinary time of major challenge. So how do we go about navigating all that on the eve, by the way, of Trafalgar Day, which falls tomorrow? So it's an interesting little parallel to think about navigation. Well, I think we need to deep root our thinking, firstly, as we're addressing what all the issues are and how we deal with them, deep root our thinking in our own charities' charitable purposes. Read them and ponder them with fresh eyes against the background we're now living through. Have a fresh conversation amongst your trustees about those purposes and who they enable your charity to help. Have a fresh conversation about what needs you're there to address. What do the purposes tell you about how you can help the people you're there to help, or in some cases must respond to the particular needs? What is the parameters of the methodology that flows from your charitable purposes? Having gone back to fundamentally what are we here for, and who and how, then we set that, I think, against the context of how the economic pressures are impacting on those people and those needs. The extreme rises in energy, fuel and transport costs, the extraordinary rise in the cost of living and inflation, the cost pressures around financial matters where we're borrowing money. Mortgages is a classic example. So analyse the major impacts on the people you are helping. And what is that telling you? Are there already and will there be even more people in need? Will the need be more extreme? Then think about the impacts on your charity. Its own costs are rising and the pressures are taking a toll also on the people that your charity depends on to deliver the work. Paid staff, yes, but certainly volunteers. The transport costs alone now for a volunteer to get from A to B to do what it is they're volunteering to do for you are increasingly great. Certainly in my conversations with volunteers, I'm hearing people saying they want to keep doing what they do for their charity, but they don't know how they'll afford transport costs, bus fares, the petrol and diesel, the congestion charge that's coming in Bristol for certain vehicles, the enormous hike in parking fees, and you could go on. So how are the pressures impacting on the people that are vital for delivering your work, as well as the people you're there to help? Think about current and future donors and other funders and as well. Perhaps some of them won't be able to keep up their current support, and others may not be able to engage with the charity in the ways you might have hoped or indeed expected and planned for. And as you think about the growing need, be clear about what needs your charity is there to address. Can we lawfully deal with this need? Does it fall properly within our charitable purposes? So, a charity with purposes to address poverty by providing debt advice is recognising that the extraordinary rise in transport costs are making it really hard for people in debt need to attend the debt clinic they run. That's an issue about access to the service. But they also recognise that within the extraordinary financial pressures on the people who have debt issues, the cost of getting to other places is really biting on them and their debt issues. Shops, medical appointment, workplaces. But this is a debt advice charity. It can't set up a community transport scheme and use its resources to get people to the shops, to medical appointments, to workplaces. Its purpose is to address poverty needs by advising people in relation to debt. Think about a charity with a purpose to further education amongst children in specific countries by providing equipment to help them study at school. Extraordinary economic pressures on the families of those children, but that charity cannot provide emergency income support grants to their families. So, can your charity address the need? If it potentially can, should it? Which needs is it appropriate to take? Because whatever needs you're rising to, there will be an element of having to choose where your resources are being addressed. If you put your resources into meeting this increased or different or sharper need, how will that impact on the other activities that you do to help people? Ed, thank you. If you could flip us on. So what should charities perhaps be specifically addressing? Well, I think reviewing their current strategy and the key strategic objectives that come out of that is one of those areas. You set this strategy at a time and you set these objectives at a time when things were not as they now are. And that I can virtually guarantee, given the scale of change over the last few months even. Do you need to reforecast your income and expenditure levels and the risks on those? Do you need to rethink the certainty and probability of income? There's no doubt about it. In many charities I have connections with, both professionally and personally, I can absolutely see that certainty or probability of income is not what it was. And it's become more negative, not more positive in many cases. Do we need to think about how we're using our resources, rethink how we can reallocate our resources? Are we free to reallocate them? Anything that we haven't yet deployed, is it a resource that we're actually obliged to use in a particular way? Restricted purpose funds or resources acquired for a restricted purpose. In the face of growing need, we may not have the freedom to redeploy some resources. But if we do rethink our resources and we can move some free resources that are not restricted, what will the impact of that be on other areas of activity? The resources can clearly only be used once, and they are limited and they are under pressure. Think about our donor and supporters' capacity, their energy levels, as well as their sheer financial levels. At what point are they going to be under such pressure from other demands that they will perhaps redirect their available resources somewhere else? And even in the face of growing need, we might have the hard choice of reducing activity. Can others help with the need that you perceive? Is there a way in which you could signpost help from other sources? But remember, even in signposting, there will be a demand to a certain extent on your resources, people time, direct costs of additional communications, changing existing material. So there's again a balancing act to take here as we navigate our way through all this. Ed, if you could change the visual, please. The Charity Commission Chair has made comment about this and struck a sombre tone in his first real public pronouncements at the annual public meeting of the Charity Commission about not underestimating the problems charities are facing and the surging costs they have. In his view, service demands will rocket. Families will be forced, he thinks, to cut non-essential spending, and he thinks it's inevitable that donations will be squeezed, and that the simultaneous pressures may, quote, bring some charities close to the brink. So there is an awareness on the part of the regulator of the extraordinary circumstances, but it can't provide direct relief. Its key messages are that it's trustees' absolute responsibility to pay urgent attention to prudence and sound financial stewardship in this situation. That getting that right, making those right hard choices, is even more important because of the situation. Coming back to that fundamental point about why have we got these resources, who are we here to serve, and also a message that we should expect increased scrutiny from the public, our supporters, and our regulator. So, some points in which we might navigate from the way we might tackle it, some expectations from our regulator, some routes to go on what's going to be a debate for trustees, and some actions for trustees, really for the foreseeable future. Thank you, Ed. Which brings us on to one or two quick points about news before we move on to really think some more with you about any questions that you have. I think from some comments from the two most senior people in the Charity Commission recently, I would say there's some clear areas of focus for the Commission. A clear expectation of vigilance in the stewardship of charities in these challenging economic times. That message is coming through loud and clear. There's also a strong commitment coming through to deal firmly with what the Commission's chair described as those who are, quotes, grossly negligent or intentional wrongdoers in charities. And there is a willingness for the regulator to use its powers robustly where there is abuse or misconduct, to stop what is wrong and to return an affected charity to what the Commission describes as sound management. The chair indicated that kind of approach is being embedded throughout the Commission under the core principles of being a fair, balanced and independent regulator, but being able and willing to act where appropriate. So that's some messages coming from our regulator. Also, there's been a very particular range of concerns raised in very recent days around whether the Charity Commission is in any sense narrowing its view on what's appropriate activity for charities in the public sector debate, the public forum debate, not party political, but the public forum debate sphere and the campaigning sphere. And what's triggered the anxieties there is the issue by the Commission of its new so-called 5-minute guide to campaigning, which is on its website. It's done a little bit of trumpeting of that tool. Now, to counterbalance that, I think it has to be said that it is an absolute legal fact that the law in relation to charities, public forum activities and campaigning has not changed. There is no legal change and the regulator is there to work under the law as we have it. And also they haven't actually changed their full guidance on campaigning, which remains as it was. But there is an anxiety. And of course, this is an area where, given where we find ourselves, many charities are feeling that part of what they should continue to do is to speak out on subjects that are relevant to their mission. And then the third area I was going to briefly mention, there is going to be some more legal change and more change with the interaction with another regulator, Companies House, because of the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill. It is in Parliament and, well, it was making progress. Who knows what may come, but at the moment the intention is that should become law at some point, and lots of impacts of it, and many of them actually will impact on the charity sector in various ways. It's got good underlying aims, which is to reduce risks of economic crime and people's ability to hide in the shadows. But for us, it will particularly impact on the fact that there'll be new obligations for all companies to provide evidence of identity and other information about their directors, the trustees, and certain other people when items are filed at Companies House, and there will be new verification steps to take. It will be more complex. Rather, as Ed pointed out, that multi-factor authentication is by definition more complex. We're going to have to get used to change. We don't know when, but it will come. It'll affect all charitable companies, all trading subsidiaries, all other companies charities in any way deal with. So think about suppliers, for example, and of course it'll impact on other types of companies like your trading subsidiaries and any CICs that you have links with. We don't know when it'll happen. And the other thing that has occurred to me, and this is simply me going, what about that then? Let's wait to see whether anything comes out. If the scale of this change is impacting across all of those organisations, will the Charity Commission do something in relation to the public data available on charitable incorporated organisations and verifications there? That is my speculation, but it's not beyond the bounds of possibility. Ed, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We have another charity catch-up planned for November, so we'll let you know the date of that, and the booking will open very soon. But we're delighted that you've joined us today. I hope you found it really helpful. We don't do this for our own benefit. We do it to be able to, as part of our giving into the sector, part of our helping you run your charity well. And so actually we want to do that job as well as we can. So actually, if you've got any feedback at all about perhaps topics that you'd like us to cover, or perhaps even the format and the style of the events and the way we do things, as we head into 2023, we're really keen to kind of make sure that these are as effective as possible, and we'd really value your input. So when that email comes around this afternoon, do just hit a quick reply and just let us know how you found it, and we would love to hear from you. Meanwhile, have a great afternoon, and we'll see you very soon. Bye for now.